Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Strategic Labs, the channel where we deeply analyze the ideas, narratives, and strategies behind the documents. We are Sarah and Mark. Today, we are going to dive into the material we have on the table. Before we start, please leave a like, share the episode, subscribe to the channel, and remember to check the description for the links to access the original material.
Exactly. And I really think the material today is going to completely change how you view urban conflict.
Yeah, totally. Because to really get into the core of this analysis, I want you to first, picture the kind of footage that inevitably rolls across your screen when the evening news covers urban violence in Brazil.
Right. It's always that very specific aesthetic.
It is. It's this incredibly visceral, almost cinematic aesthetic that we've all been conditioned to recognize. You see the sprawling, densely packed architecture of a favela.
Yeah, the narrow streets, the brick houses stacked on top of each other.
Exactly. And you see tactical police units moving nervously through these narrow alleyways. And most importantly, you see what appears to be a completely fragmented, anarchic firefight.
It looks like pure chaos, right? Like a total breakdown of civilization.
It really does. It looks like random street gangs, just armed to the teeth, lashing out in this lawless free-for-all. But the entire premise of our deep dive today, based on the documents, completely shatters that perception.
It does. It flips the whole script.
Because what if that chaos is not a breakdown of order at all? What if the seemingly random violence is actually a meticulously orchestrated illusion?
And that's the scary part, right? The idea that the real power, the actual undisputed command and control, is hidden behind maximum security prison bars.
Right, behind prison bars and layers of encrypted code. I mean, it forces us to completely reevaluate our baseline assumptions.
It really forces you to look at how power operates in the 21st century. We look at these urban conflict zones and we impose this traditional, almost antiquated model of statehood onto them.
Like, we just assume the government is the only legitimate authority.
Exactly. We assume anyone shooting at the government is just a chaotic criminal element. But the reality on the ground in Brazil, according to the source material, is a highly sophisticated ecosystem of shadow governance.
Shadow governance. Let's unpack that because it's a huge term.
Well, we are looking at a hybrid war. You have the Primeiro Comando de Capital, the PCC, alongside rogue paramilitary militias and fractured state intelligence agencies. And they were all locked in this relentless battle for control.
And the text makes it clear they aren't just breaking the law, right? They are rewriting the rules of sovereignty.
That's exactly it. They're rewriting sovereignty.
And that concept is exactly where we need to start.
Yeah.
Because if you look closely at the opening operation detailed in our material, the facade of chaos drops almost immediately.
Yeah, the São Paulo raid. That's a perfect example.
So picture this. It's dawn on the northern outskirts of São Paulo. The state moves in with overwhelming force. Hundreds of federal police officers.
Tactical helicopters chopping through the air.
Right. Searchlights cutting through the mist. They are hitting a massive favela complex. And to the public, it's framed as a crackdown on a disorganized, violent pocket of criminality.
A messy shootout ensues, naturally.
Yeah, a messy shootout. But the real story isn't the gunfire. The real story is what the police found when the smoke cleared.
Which is just wild when you read the inventory.
It is. They didn't just kick down doors and find a bunch of teenagers with rusty revolvers and a stash of narcotics.
No, they found military-grade encrypted radios.
Encrypted radios. They found highly complex communications equipment, server routing hardware, and this is the kicker documentation of a rigorously structured command hierarchy.
It's like finding a corporate regional office hidden in a war zone.
Exactly. I look at this operation and I realize we aren't dealing with a street gang. We're dealing with a massive, chaotic orchestra.
And the conductor is completely invisible.
Which brings up the fundamental paradox of this entire ecosystem. Right.
Right, the paradox of visibility. If they have the capability to operate with the logistical precision of, say, a Fortune 500 company or a military battalion.
Why do they allow their operations to look so messy and disorganized to the general public?
Exactly. Why draw the attention of helicopters and heavily armed police units at all?
Because if I'm running a billion-dollar illicit empire, my number one priority is flying under the radar. I mean, violence is bad for business.
It brings heat. It disrupts your supply chains.
Right. So if they are so brilliant, why is the street level a perpetual war zone?
Well, the text explains that in an environment defined by fragmented power, Violence isn't a failure of negotiation.
Not a breakdown.
No, violence is the language of the negotiation itself. In these territories, no single entity holds a monopoly on authority,
Not even the state.
especially not the state. The Brazilian state claims sovereignty, but functionally it doesn't possess it. The PCC controls vast networks, but they still have to navigate rival factions and state incursions.
And local paramilitaries hold their own ground, too.
Right. So when you see a massive, chaotic firefight on the news, you aren't watching a breakdown in law. You are watching a highly calculated display of political theater.
I want to challenge that slightly, though, just to play devil's advocate.
Sure, go ahead.
Calling a shootout political theater sounds very academic. But on the ground, isn't it just a territorial land grab? Like, it's brutal, basic survival.
You mean if a rival gang moves onto your corner, you shoot them?
Right. That doesn't necessarily mean there's a grand political strategy at play. It's just a turf war.
It might seem that way at the micro level, sure, but you have to zoom out and look at the synchronization. A shootout over a specific street corner might be a localized dispute.
Okay, so when does it become theater?
When a cartel orchestrates a synchronized wave of violence across multiple neighborhoods simultaneously.
Oh, like when they target specific police outposts.
Exactly. Or burn buses on major arterial roads. That is a deliberate communication strategy. They are managing perceptions.
Ah, I see. So they use violence to signal operational capacity to their rivals.
And more importantly, they use it to paralyze the state's decision-making apparatus.
Right, because if the state attempts to enforce a new policy or raid a key logistics hub, the cartel doesn't file a lawsuit.
They don't lobby a politician. They trigger a localized insurgency.
Wow. It looks like chaos, but the message is perfectly clear. They're basically saying, if you push into our territory, the political and economic cost to your administration will be catastrophic.
Exactly. The chaos is essentially a weaponized deterrent.
They are projecting an aura of sheer unpredictability just to make the state hesitate.
And underneath that turbulent surface layer, the actual operational structure is remarkably rigid.
Which leads us to one of the most fascinating aspects of this entire analysis. Because
Yeah.
if we want to understand how a criminal organization learned to operate with such disciplined military precision.
We have to look at where that command structure was forged.
Right. And it wasn't out on the streets of São Paulo. The crucible that created the PCC was the prison system.
We have to go back to the early 1990s for this.
Yeah, we're looking at the Taubaté Penitentiary and the infamous Carandiru Penitentiary Massacre of 1992.
Carandiru is the absolute focal point for understanding the modern Brazilian underworld.
It really is the ground zero for all of it.
Oh, you have an environment characterized by severe overcrowding, profound systemic neglect, and just daily brutality.
The state had essentially locked tens of thousands of men in a cage and thrown away the key.
They abdicated any responsibility for their safety or their basic human rights.
And the culmination of that neglect was the 1992 massacre. A riot broke out in Carandiru, and the military police were sent in to quell it.
And quell is a horribly inadequate word.
It really is. I mean, they executed 111 inmates. Many of them were unarmed, just hiding in their cells. It was an absolute slaughter.
And the irony that emerges from this trauma is staggering, according to the documents.
Right, because the PCC wasn't founded by men who wanted to spread anarchy and violence.
It was founded by men who were desperate for order.
Think about that. The state had created a total vacuum of law, so the inmates had to invent their own laws just to survive the very people who were supposed to be guarding them.
Exactly. It was a survivalist response to state failure. And because the threat of death was so constant, either from rival prison factions or the guards themselves, the structure they built had to be absolute.
They couldn't just form a loose brotherhood.
No, they established what is essentially a corporate board of directors known as the Command Council.
Let's break down that command council because it is terrifyingly corporate.
It's very structured.
You have the founding members at the apex. Below them, you have regional commanders who are responsible for specific geographical cell blocks or prisons.
And below them, you have the foot soldiers.
But it's their internal justice system that really strikes me. They implemented a strict code of conduct that actually outlawed certain crimes in their territories on the outside.
Right. They explicitly banned violence against women and children in the neighborhoods they controlled.
Which is a brilliant tactical move. By enforcing a moral code that the state itself was failing to provide, they cultivated a veneer of legitimacy.
They positioned themselves not as predators, but as the true functioning authority in the favelas.
They were building a brand, They provided dispute resolution. If someone in the neighborhood robbed a local bakery, you didn't call the police.
Because the police might not show up, or they might demand a bribe just to do their job.
Exactly. So you went to the PCC, and the PCC's justice was swift and final. But inside the organization, that discipline is maintained through sheer terror.
There is no human resources department giving you a written warning for insubordination.
No performance reviews here. If a member of the PCC leaks information or disobeys a direct order from the command council, the punishment is lethal.
And it's executed flawlessly, even within the confines of a lockdown.
Which brings me to the technological reality that I find genuinely baffling. How does this prison-based structure actually execute complex operations on the outside?
To understand that, we have to look at the 2017 São Paulo crisis.
Yes, let's dissect 2017, because you have a scenario where the entire city of São Paulo, a massive global metropolis, is brought to its knees.
Synchronized attacks everywhere.
Buses are torched, major transportation arteries are paralyzed, off-duty police officers are targeted and assassinated. The city just grinds to a halt.
And the intelligence eventually reveals that the orders for this massive siege came from inside a maximum security prison.
I need to understand the mechanics of this.
Right.
How does a man locked in a concrete box, stripped of his rights, under 2047 surveillance, orchestrate a citywide military campaign without the state intercepting a single command?
It requires an invisible, multi-layered web of communication. The fundamental shift in perspective here is that the prison is no longer a cage.
What is it then?
It is a heavily fortified, state-funded headquarters. The PCC utilizes a combination of smuggled digital technology and highly disciplined analog tradecraft.
Let's start with the digital level.
Right, so you have the physical contraband. Smartphones are smuggled in, often dismantled and hidden in body cavities.
Or brought in by corrupt guards who are either bribed or threatened.
Exactly. But having a smartphone in a prison isn't enough on its own.
Right, because prisons have cell tower triangulation, they have stingrays, they have wardens monitoring data traffic.
If an inmate turns on an iPhone and calls a cartel lieutenant, the state is going to pinpoint that signal in 3 seconds.
So how do they get around that?
Yeah.
That is exactly where the technological sophistication comes into play.
They aren't just making standard cellular calls. The hardware is heavily modified. They utilize encrypted messaging applications, and they route all their traffic through virtual private networks, or VPNs.
So for anyone listening who might not be familiar with how a VPN defeats state surveillance, let's explain the mechanism.
Good idea.
When you use a VPN, you are essentially creating a secure, encrypted tunnel between your device and a server located somewhere else in the world.
Right. So if the prison authorities are monitoring the local network traffic, they don't see a text message saying, "Burn the buses on Avenue Paulista."
All they see is an encrypted data packet bouncing to a server in Switzerland or Russia.
They can't read the content, and they can't easily trace the final destination.
Precisely. And they combine this with the constant cycling of SIM cards.
Yeah, an operative inside will use a specific SIM card for a single critical communication burst and then instantly destroy the card.
Burner chips, basically.
Mm.
But the PCC knows that digital technology is vulnerable to jamming.
Exactly. If the state throws a blanket frequency jammer over the penitentiary, the VPNs and the smartphones become expensive paperweights.
So they never rely solely on digital infrastructure. They use layered analog methods as well.
Like the frequency hopping radios mentioned in the material, that is a concept straight out of military electronic warfare.
It really is. Frequency hopping is a method of transmitting radio signals by rapidly switching a carrier among many frequency channels.
It's very hard to track.
Let me try an analogy here to make sure I'm grasping how difficult this is to intercept. Imagine you and I are trying to have a conversation in a crowded stadium.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
If we just stand in one place and talk, anyone next to us can hear. That's a standard radio transmission.
Right.
But frequency hopping is like us having a conversation where we instantly teleport to a different seat in the stadium after every single syllable.
Unless someone else has the exact synchronized map of where we are going to teleport next, all they hear is random noise.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. The transmitter and the receiver are synchronized to a specific pseudo-random pattern.
The state intelligence agencies might pick up a split-second blip of static on one frequency, but by the time their equipment locks onto it, the transmission has already hopped to another channel.
It makes real-time interception nearly impossible without highly advanced military-grade decryption hardware.
And even if you strip away the radios and the smartphones, they still have the human element.
Yeah, The analog, low-tech methods.
They use coded phrases that mimic everyday chatter. A boss inside might make a seemingly innocent, legally permitted phone call to a relative.
Right, he talks about a soccer match or the weather or a family member's health.
But the weather turning bad in the South is actually a coded directive to shift a major cocaine shipment.
They also utilize the physical movements of visitors and defense attorneys,
That's a huge node in their network. A lawyer legally reviewing case files with an inmate can easily facilitate the transfer of micronotes or verbal commands.
which demonstrates the concept of nodal network resilience. If the state successfully jams the digital signals, the analog radios take over.
And if the radios are confiscated, the visitor network activates.
If one node of communication is compromised, the network instantaneously reroutes the flow of information.
The 2017 crisis was essentially a terrifying proof of concept for this.
The PCC was sending a deeply psychological message to the government.
They were saying, you may have our bodies locked in maximum security, but we own the streets. We hold the remote control to the city.
That level of hybrid warfare is staggering. You have a criminal syndicate running a highly digitized, transnational empire from behind bars.
But the reality on the ground is even more complicated.
Right, because the state isn't just fighting the PCC. While the cartels are running their parallel state from the prisons, the government is dealing with a completely different kind of shadow governance on the streets.
And this is where the narrative takes an incredibly dark, almost dystopian turn.
Because this second enemy wasn't born out of neglect in the prison system. This enemy was created by the state itself.
We need to talk about the militias.
Yes, the rise of the militias in Rio de Janeiro. It fundamentally complicates the dynamic of urban control.
When we look at areas like Jardim Esperança and martial armies, we aren't looking at traditional drug cartels.
Because the cartels, for all their power, are still fundamentally anti-state actors.
Right. But the militias represent a terrifying inversion of that. They are predominantly composed of active duty police officers, ex-military personnel, firefighters, and prison guards.
They are the state.
They are the state's shadow. They patrol the streets in plain clothes, often wearing balaclavas, driving unmarked vehicles.
And their initial pitch to these communities was based on protection, wasn't it?
Yes. They presented themselves as an extreme, lethal solution to the cartel problem.
The argument was essentially, the official justice system is too slow, too corrupt, and too restricted by human rights laws to protect you from the PCC or the Comando Vermelho.
We know how the cartels operate, we have the tactical training, and we will eradicate them from your neighborhood.
So they start as vigilantes. They operate as death squads, rooting out the drug traffickers with extreme prejudice.
So once they clear a neighborhood of the cartel, they don't hand the territory back to the formal government.
Of course not. They realize that controlling a neighborhood is incredibly lucrative.
And this is where I struggle with the terminology in our source material. The texts refer to this as a paradox of parallel governance.
Right, but wait a minute. If a group of armed men takes over a neighborhood, kicks out the rival gang, and then starts demanding money from the local businesses to prevent accidents from happening.
How is that governance?
Exactly. That's not parallel statehood. That is literally just a classic mafia protection racket. It's extortion 101.
It begins as a protection racket, certainly. But the evolution from a mafia into a parallel government lies in the depth of their systemic extraction.
And their monopolization of civic life.
Right. Exactly. A traditional mafia extorts businesses and runs illicit markets. Gambling, prostitution, loan sharking.
But the militias in Rio went much further.
They recognized that the state had failed to provide basic urban infrastructure. So the militias stepped into that void and privatized the public utilities.
This is the part that is so hard to wrap your head around. They don't just ask for a cut of the local bakery's profits.
No, they literally take over the water supply.
They control the distribution of water. They control the sale of cooking gas canisters, which is essential for survival in these areas.
If a resident needs gas to cook dinner, they cannot buy it from a legal outside distributor. The militia enforces a strict monopoly and charges exorbitant markups.
They hijack the telecommunications infrastructure, providing illegal cable TV hookups and internet access, and they tax the residents for the privilege of using it.
They control the alternative transportation networks, too. The fleets of informal vans and motorcycle taxis that navigate the steep hills of the favelas where public buses don't go.
So if you live in one of these neighborhoods, your entire existence is monetized by men in balaclavas.
You wake up, you pay the militia for the water you drink,
You pay the militia for the gas you use to cook your food. You pay the militia to ride the van down the hill to go to your formal job in the city.
And you pay the militia for the internet you use at night.
They have entirely supplanted the state's role in providing basic services.
And beyond the economic extraction, they supplant the state's judicial role. As we discussed with the PCC, the militias also act as the neighborhood dispute court.
Right. If there is a domestic dispute, a property line disagreement, or a noise complaint, the residents are forbidden from calling the official police.
They must bring the issue to the militia leadership, who dispense immediate and often violent arbitration.
You call the police, and the police who show up might actually be the same guys running the militia, just wearing their official uniforms today instead of their plain clothes.
The psychological trap that creates for a civilian is horrifying. You cannot trust anyone.
Which brings us to the social control aspect. We talk a lot about the physical violence, but the source material details a level of psychological warfare that is incredibly modern.
We aren't just talking about thugs standing on corners with rifles. We are talking about digital surveillance.
The coercive equilibrium maintained by the militias relies heavily on intelligence gathering.
And in the modern era, that means monitoring social media. The militias employ individuals specifically to monitor local Facebook groups, WhatsApp chats, and community forums.
Because in a normal society, if the water company overcharges you, you go on Twitter and complain. Or you organize a neighborhood protest.
But in Jardim Esperança, if a resident posts a complaint about the price of cooking gas or anonymously questions the actions of the militia online,
the consequences are severe.
They are lethal. The militias use their digital surveillance to root out dissent before it can materialize into collective action.
They will identify the individual who posted the complaint, and that person will disappear.
This creates an environment of total, suffocating self-censorship.
The civilians living in these areas are trapped in an invisible prison. They walk the streets, they go to work, but their words, their money, and their basic utilities are entirely dictated by a shadow authority.
It is the ultimate tragic irony. The communities cheered when the militias arrived to drive out the drug cartels, only to realize they had invited a far more insidious parasite into their homes.
A cartel might shoot up a street corner, but a militia will tax the very air you breathe.
So as you were listening to this, digesting the sheer scale of this problem, the obvious question screams out.
What on earth is the official, legitimate Brazilian government doing about this?
Exactly. You have cartels running global logistics from maximum security lockdown, and you have ex-cops running feudal extortion rackets in the streets.
Why can't a nation with the resources of Brazil just sweep in and dismantle this architecture?
To understand the paralysis of the state, we have to look inward. We have to examine the profound institutional weaknesses and the bureaucratic fragmentation within the Brazilian intelligence and law enforcement apparatus.
This is an asymmetric intelligence war, and the state is fighting with one hand tied behind its back because its own agencies are fundamentally at odds with one another.
Let's get into the specifics of that infighting, because the material paints a picture of a system practically designed to fail.
You have two primary actors trying to tackle this issue. The federal police and ABIN, which is the Brazilian intelligence agency.
And structurally, culturally, they operate in completely different realities.
It's a classic clash between tactical execution and strategic intelligence. The federal police are a law enforcement body.
Their mandate, their culture, and their operational metrics are based on action.
They want to identify a target, kick down the door, seize the contraband, make the arrests, and parade the suspects in front of the media.
They rely on immediate, actionable intelligence, often tips from informants or quick wiretaps.
Right. They are the muscle. They want results today.
But ABIN operates on an entirely different timeline. They are the strategic brains.
Their job isn't to arrest low-level dealers. Their job is to map the entire architecture of the PCC.
They want to sit back in a dark room, monitor the encrypted chatter, identify the VPN routing protocols, track the financial flows through shell companies, and slowly piece together the puzzle.
They are incredibly cautious because they are protecting deep cover assets and long-term surveillance operations.
And those differing philosophies create catastrophic coordination failures when the two agencies are forced to collaborate.
The source material details a specific, highly revealing operation in São Paulo where this interagency rivalry essentially sabotaged a major strike against a PCC logistics network.
I want to break down exactly how that raid fell apart, because it is a masterclass in bureaucratic dysfunction.
You have ABIN sitting on gold mine signals intelligence, They have intercepted communications, indicating a major movement of cartel assets.
But because of their culture of caution, their vetting protocols are exhaustive. Before they share that intelligence with the federal police, it has to go through multiple layers of jurisdictional checks and legal review.
And the friction isn't just cultural, it's technological. ABIN is utilizing highly encrypted, proprietary digital platforms to manage their intelligence.
But the frontline tactical units of the federal police are operating on legacy systems. They are using standard, often unencrypted radio frequencies and older databases.
So you have a situation where ABIN finally decides to authorize the release of a priority target list to the tactical teams. They send the data packet.
But because of the incompatible tech and the bureaucratic red tape, the data gets stuck in transit.
It's sitting in a digital holding pattern, waiting for a decryption key or a physical signature from a magistrate.
While the clock is ticking.
Exactly. While the clock is ticking on a highly mobile cartel operation. So by the time the federal police tactical commanders actually receive the actionable coordinates, the information is hours, sometimes days, out of date.
The police mobilize, they send in the helicopters, they kick down the doors of the safe houses.
And the houses are completely empty.
Or worse, in some instances, because the PCC has their own counterintelligence operatives monitoring the cumbersome, fragmented mobilization of the state police forces, the cartel scouts pick up on the raid before it even happens.
The police end up walking right into prepared ambushes.
It's maddening. It sounds like human resources paperwork and incompatible software updates are literally getting police officers killed.
Which makes me wonder, are the cartels just inherently faster and more adaptable because they don't have to deal with legal departments?
They don't have human rights oversight committees.
Ah.
They don't have to worry about interdepartmental budget disputes.
The cartels benefit immensely from a flat, ruthless decision-making hierarchy. If a regional commander of the PCC receives intelligence that a route is compromised, he doesn't need to convene a legal review board.
He issues an order via encrypted text, and the route is shifted within minutes. The cartel exploits the lag time inherent in a democratic bureaucracy.
However, it is absolutely vital to emphasize that the state is not entirely helpless or incompetent.
When the bureaucracy gets out of the way, the Brazilian state is capable of executing highly sophisticated, incredibly brave intelligence victories.
We cannot discuss this hidden war without talking about the infiltration operation involving the operative codenamed Agent Vento.
Agent Vento. Reading the sections on Vento was genuinely like reading a high-stakes espionage thriller.
But the realization that real human lives were hanging in the balance makes it profoundly heavy. We have to dive deep into what this individual actually accomplished.
Yeah.
Because it goes far beyond a standard undercover sting.
Agent Vento was a deep-cover operative from the federal police. His mission was to penetrate the mid-level command structure of the PCC, specifically targeting their logistics and supply chain coordination.
Getting to that position isn't like in the movies where you just put on a leather jacket and hang out at a bar.
It required months of painstakingly building a fabricated criminal identity. The state had to create verifiable arrest records, fake financial histories, and a deeply layered backstory that could withstand the scrutiny of the PCC's own counterintelligence apparatus.
And the scrutiny is absolute. We talked earlier about how the cartel's internal discipline is lethal. Vento had to seamlessly integrate into a culture of extreme violence and paranoia.
I want you to imagine the linguistic tightrope this man was walking every single day.
The PCC has its own highly specific vernacular, its own slang, its own rituals of respect and protocol.
If Vento used a term that was slightly outdated, or if his posture was wrong during a meeting, or if he showed a split second of hesitation when a commander ordered a violent action, his cover would be blown.
There is no backup team waiting outside in a van to rush in and save him. If the PCC discovers a rat, the execution is immediate and usually agonizing.
The psychological toll of that kind of immersion is unfathomable. You are entirely isolated.
You have to feign loyalty and brotherhood with individuals who are actively ordering executions and orchestrating terror.
You have to participate in the planning of illicit operations, all while trying to secretly memorize data, encryption keys, and routing schedules to transmit back to your handlers.
And transmitting that data out is incredibly dangerous. How did he even do that? If he's embedded in their logistics, he's surrounded by cartel members who are paranoid about cell phones and bugs.
He had to use deeply clandestine methods, burst transmissions using encrypted devices hidden in dead drops.
Memorizing complex alphanumeric tracking codes for weapons shipments and writing them down only when he was completely isolated.
He lived with a metaphorical gun to his head every second of every day.
But the sheer endurance of that operation yielded one of the most monumental breakthroughs in the state's fight against the cartel.
Because Vento was operating within the logistics node, he gained access to the PCC's encrypted communication channels and real-time strategic movement ledgers.
He wasn't just busting low-level dealers, he was looking at the cartel's supply chain matrix.
And the intelligence he transmitted allowed the federal police to map and eventually dismantle a massive PCC weapons pipeline.
This wasn't a pipeline moving handguns into a favela. This was a heavy armaments route that stretched deep across the border into Bolivia.
Vento's intel allowed the state to preempt orchestrated attacks, seize caches of assault rifles, and fundamentally disrupt the flow of military-grade hardware that was fueling the urban warfare in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro.
It's an incredible story of human endurance. But mentioning Bolivia is the crucial pivot point for the grand finale of this analysis.
Because while Agent Venter's intelligence was a massive victory for the state, the raw data he uncovered proved something utterly terrifying about the nature of the enemy.
The PCC isn't just a Brazilian problem anymore. They haven't just outgrown the prison system, they have outgrown their national borders.
They are engaging in what our source material defines as shadow globalization.
We are no longer looking at a regional gang. We're looking at a multinational geopolitical empire.
The transnational evolution of the PCC is arguably the most alarming paradigm shift in this entire briefing.
They have transitioned from a localized protection syndicate, born in the squalor of Carandiru, into a formidable global actor.
The material outlines several massive cross-border interdictions that illustrate this scale. Look at the border interception at Puerto Falcón, a major crossing point between Argentina and Paraguay.
Let's visualize that bust. You have a massive commercial convoy, semi-trucks, shipping containers.
To the border guards, the manifest says it's carrying standard agricultural supplies, soybeans or fertilizer. It looks entirely legitimate.
But when the intelligence units finally crack open the containers, hidden behind the false bulkheads, they find vast quantities of refined narcotics, heavy military weapons, and advanced military-grade encrypted communication service.
This isn't a smuggling run in the back of a pickup truck. This is heavy international corporate freight.
And their reach extends far beyond South America. The true indicator of their geopolitical power is their expansion into European logistics hubs.
The material highlights a specific staggering seizure in Antwerp, Belgium.
The Antwerp bust is where the scale really hits you. Nearly 3 tons of high-purity cocaine. 3 tons.
And it wasn't just stuffed in duffel bags. It was chemically disguised as industrial liquids, seamlessly integrated into global maritime shipping lanes.
3 tons of cocaine arriving in the heart of Europe proves that the PCC has established end-to-end supply chains, deep-water port access, and distribution networks that stretch across the Atlantic and are now actively expanding into Asian markets.
But this brings up a massive logistical hurdle. You don't just show up at the port of Antwerp with 3 tons of cocaine and start unloading it.
You need port authority access, you need local distributors, you need muscle on the ground in Europe. How is a Brazilian prison gang managing operations in Belgium?
They manage it through a sophisticated strategy of criminal diplomacy.
The PCC realized long ago that imperial conquest, trying to shoot their way into new territories and take over by force, is inefficient and draws too much state heat.
So they don't invade Paraguay or Bolivia or Europe. They integrate. They form strategic alliances with established local syndicates.
I see. So rather than fighting the local mafia in Europe, they partner with them.
Exactly. They embed liaison officers, highly trained facilitators with local cartels. They negotiate mutual protection pacts.
But the real currency of their diplomacy is knowledge. The PCC will approach a regional drug trafficking organization in Paraguay and offer them a deal.
The PCC provides access to their highly advanced operational security protocols, their encrypted communication tech, and their global buyers.
In exchange, the local cartel provides the physical transit routes and the bribes to local border officials.
It is exactly like a multinational corporate franchise expanding into new foreign markets.
Think about how a massive tech company operates. When they want to open operations in a new country, they don't build everything from scratch.
They partner with local logistics firms, but they share their proprietary supply chain software to optimize the whole system.
The PCC is franchising their specific model of organized disorder. They are exporting the intellectual property of shadow governance.
And by operating this way, they construct a nodal network design. This is crucial for understanding why they are so difficult to defeat.
A traditional mafia is hierarchical. If you cut off the head, the body dies. But a nodal network operates like the internet.
Let's use the internet analogy because it perfectly explains their resilience. The internet relies on packet switching.
If a fiber optic cable is cut in New York, your email to London doesn't fail. The routers instantaneously calculate a new path and send the data through Miami.
The PCC operates exactly the same way. If the Brazilian Federal Police and Interpol collaborate to bust a major transshipment route in Bolivia, the PCC's overall network doesn't collapse.
Their encrypted servers instantly reroute the upcoming shipments through an alternate, pre-established node in Paraguay or Uruguay.
They use this shadow globalization to render themselves practically indestructible to localized law enforcement.
By integrating themselves into the socio-political and economic fabric of these borderlands, they co-opt local officials, exploit weak state presence, and create a system where taking down one node barely registers as a disruption to the global supply chain.
So bringing all these massive tangled threads together, we've journeyed from the bloody cell blocks of Carandiru in the 1990s to the encrypted radios in the São Paulo favelas to the militias taxing the drinking water in Rio, through the bureaucratic nightmare of the intelligence agencies, all the way to 3-ton cocaine shipments in Belgium.
When you step back and look at the totality of this hidden war, what does this all mean? What is the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, regarding the fundamental nature of power and authority today?
If we synthesize this entire deep dive, the inescapable conclusion is that the traditional textbook definition of a nation-state is dying.
We are taught that a sovereign government has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force and the provision of order.
But Brazil is acting as a terrifying mirror for modern societies across the globe. We are watching the normalization of hybrid conflicts.
When a criminal enterprise can act as a sovereign state, when they can provide social services, enforce their own judicial codes, levy taxes on utilities, and manage complex international trade logistics, the very definition of what constitutes a government is fundamentally shattered.
True control is no longer dictated by who sits in a Capitol brigging or who holds a seat at the UN.
True control belongs to whoever dictates the flow of information, controls the local economy, and projects power on a granular, street-by-street level.
It completely dismantles how we view authority.
And I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to really ponder as you go about the rest of your day. We spent this time exploring how the PCC manages an international billion-dollar empire from inside a concrete prison cell, utilizing smuggled burner phones, VPNs, and frequency-hopping radios.
As technology continues its relentless advance, as decentralized, untraceable communication becomes cheaper, easier, and more accessible to absolutely everyone.
Will we see this exact model of invisible, parallel governance spread to other cities, other countries, and other democracies around the world?
If true, absolute control over a major metropolis or a regional economy or a global supply chain can be wielded from a maximum security cage via a heavily modified smartphone. Perhaps physical territory and traditional state authority matter far less than we ever realized.
The physical walls of the prison couldn't contain the cartel. Those walls merely served as a taxpayer-funded, secure headquarters for the digital frontier of modern hybrid warfare.
That is the chilling ultimate reality of this hidden war. The visual illusion of chaos on the evening news is just a smokescreen, masking a highly structured, digitally fortified, and globally expanding command.
Exactly. The chaos is a feature, not a bug. So to quickly recap our journey through this labyrinth, we started by breaking down the illusion of random street violence and the theater of fragmented power.
We discovered the sophisticated corporate-style prison command centers born from state neglect.
We explored the tragic paradox of rogue police militias acting as extortionist shadow governments, and we analyzed the fatal bureaucratic red tape that paralyzes the state's intelligence response.
Finally, we tracked the cartel's explosive, tech-driven expansion into a global nodal network.
It is a completely different, eye-opening way to view the power dynamics of the modern world. We've reached the end of this analysis. If this episode added value to your day, please leave a like, share it, and subscribe to Strategic Labs so we can keep deconstructing narratives. Remember to check the video description. See you in the next analysis.